Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going deep into late medieval philosophy with a figure you might not have heard of, Marsilius of Inghen. But trust me, as someone who loves philosophy, you'll find his ideas pretty interesting. Our main source today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on him. So, ready to jump in?
Let's dive in. Marsilius is like a bridge between the 14th and 15th centuries, a time of some serious intellectual upheaval. So his work gives us a snapshot of how philosophy was evolving during that era.
Okay, so to understand him, should we start with just like a little background on his life? What was happening in the world that might have shaped his thinking?
Well, picture Europe in the 1300s. You have the church in turmoil, splitting into different factions during the Great Schism, like major drama. And then you've got universities, like these bustling hubs of debate and intellectual exchange. It was in this kind of dynamic environment that Marsilius emerged. Born around 1340, he wasn't just some philosopher, he was a university rock star. Master at the University of Paris, founder and then 9-time rector at the University of Heidelberg.
9 times. Wow. He must have been doing something right. He really thrived in that world of intellectual challenge. So how did all this lead him to philosophy?
Yeah, well, it's easy to imagine how his experiences would push him toward trying to reconcile different schools of thought. And he was definitely influenced by nominalism, which was a school of thought that challenged the traditional views of universals. Think of it like this. You have two apples. Each one is unique, but we call them both apples.
Right.
So nominalists, like the big name William of Ockham, they'd argue that appleness, it exists as a concept, in our minds, not like a separate independent thing out there in the world.
Okay. I see how this connects to his background. Trying to make sense of a world where even the church is, like, divided.
Yeah.
Maybe nominalism offered a way to find some kind of common ground, amid all the differences.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But Marsilius wasn't just a follower of Occam. He took nominalism and added his own little twist, especially when it came to categories of being. So Aristotle, who's like the foundation for a lot of medieval thought, outlined 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, and so on. And these were like the fundamental ways to describe, well, anything that exists. But Marsilius, with his sharp, logical mind, argued for an 11th category, the category of signs.
11th category. Now, this is getting interesting. What does he mean by that? A category of signs. And why was that so important to him?
Well, this is where Marsilius's understanding of logic comes in. He was fascinated by how language shapes our perception of reality. He argued that words themselves words like genus, species, even the categories themselves, they act as signs. They're pointing to something beyond themselves. They're not just describing objects, they're shaping how we categorize and how we conceptualize those objects.
So it's not just what exists, but how we think about it and understand it through language. It's like he's adding another layer of analysis onto reality itself.
Exactly. And he believed this had some pretty big implications, especially for theology, which, well, that's where things get even more interesting, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Applying that kind of rigorous logic to matters of faith seems like, a delicate balancing act. How did Marsilius navigate that? Did he think that logic could unlock all of the mysteries of theology?
Well, he was a devout Christian, but he was also cautious. He worried about overly complex arguments the kind that might lead people away from faith. He really advocated for clear and accessible theological discussion, especially for those who weren't like experts in philosophy. So basically, he was championing a balance between the power of reason and the depths of faith.
It makes sense. It's a struggle that so many philosophers face, even today, right? Trying to figure out how to reconcile the precision of logic with the mysteries of faith. It seems like Marsilius thought both were important, but you shouldn't just, carelessly intertwine them.
You got it. And you can really see that tension when he tackles one of the biggest theological puzzles out there, right? Divine knowledge and human freedom. I mean, if God knows everything, past, present, and future, does that even leave any room for our free will?
Oh, that's a question that has puzzled theologians and philosophers for centuries. So where did Marsilius land on this one?
He was adamant that God's foreknowledge doesn't take away our ability to make our own choices, even if it seems kind of tricky logically. He was committed to preserving both divine omniscience and human free will. He didn't try to offer any easy answers. He chose to wrestle with the complexities of both faith and reason.
So he was looking for, like, nuance, not just settling for, like, simplistic answers that might undermine either faith or, human agency.
Exactly. And that commitment to nuance, to really digging deep, it extends to other philosophical areas too, especially natural philosophy and metaphysics. And this is where we start to see him really grappling with the ideas of, well, the big guy, Aristotle.
Aristotle, of course, like the foundation of so much philosophical thought. What was Marsilius' take on him? Total agreement, or did he find some points of disagreement?
Oh, he was a dedicated empiricist, meaning he believed that knowledge comes from our senses, from those self-evident truths, the basic things we just kind of know intuitively. So, yeah, he was a huge fan of Aristotle. But
There's always a but. Every great thinker brings something new to the table.
yeah.
So what was Marsilius's but when it came to Aristotle?
Well, he argued that when Aristotle contradicted religious faith, well, faith had to win out. For example, Aristotle believed in the eternity of the world, right? But Christian doctrine says it was created by God. So Marsilius was very insistent that in these instances, faith, even if it seems to clash with reason, should be our guide.
Wow, that's a fascinating perspective. He obviously really respected Aristotle, but wasn't afraid to prioritize faith when they diverged. It tells you a lot about how he approached knowledge and beliefs.
It does. He didn't shy away from those complexities and those little contradictions you run into when you try to reconcile faith and reason. And as we'll see, that theme, it pops up again and again in his other philosophical work. It's really interesting how deep Marsilius goes with logic, like really getting into the mechanics of thought and argument. He wasn't content with just the surface level stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point. He was trying to get to the bottom of how we think. So for someone like me who, loves philosophy, what are some of those key logical concepts he was exploring, and why do they matter?
Well, let's look at his views on the object of scientific knowledge. Being a good Aristotelian, Marsilius believed that true scientific knowledge has to deal with universals. So, truths that hold true always and everywhere. And here's the thing, he also knew we live in a world of individual changing things. So how do you reconcile those two?
That's a tough one. How can you claim to have universal knowledge when everything we experience is so specific and always changing? It seems like a fundamental problem in philosophy, right?
Well, Marsilius had a pretty ingenious solution. He said the object of scientific knowledge isn't actually something out there in the world. It's the mental proposition that we form that reflects that universal truth. So let's say you see a bunch of different horses, right? Each one is unique. But through a process of abstraction, we form this concept of horseness. We capture the essential qualities of what makes a horse, no matter the individual differences.
So it's like through abstracting from all those particular horses we've seen, that lets us grasp the universal, the horseness. That's a pretty insightful way to bridge that gap.
Exactly. And this ties back to his nominalism, right? Remember, nominalists say universals don't exist as separate things. For Marsilius, they're mental constructs. We create them to make sense of the world around us. But they're not random or subjective. They're based on real experiences of the similarities between things.
So he was trying to find that middle ground, wasn't he? Between the realists who think universals have their own independent existence and the pure nominalists who could be seen as like reducing everything to just isolated particulars.
Yeah.
He's saying, yeah, universals exist, but in our minds, formed from how we interact with the world.
You nailed it. And that same careful attention to detail is there when he talks about supposition, which is a pretty complex idea in medieval logic. Basically, supposition is about how terms in a proposition refer to or stand for things in the world. And Marsilius, he rejected a specific type called a simple supposition, which claimed that a term could directly refer to a universal out there in the world.
Hold on, that's a little confusing. Didn't he believe in universals? Why would he reject something that seems to support his position?
He did. But remember, for him, universals only exist in the mind. They don't have a separate reality that our words can just, directly grab onto. He was arguing for a more careful way of talking about supposition. He thought that the term simple supposition could cause confusion, especially for students who were new to logic.
So he's refining how we talk about the link between words and universals, not denying that the link exists. It's like he's saying, sure, our words can point to those abstract concepts, but let's be precise and acknowledge that they're mental constructs, not things unto themselves.
That's it. This insistence on clarity and precision is, it's everywhere in Marsilius's work. He loved the complexity of logic, but he also wanted his ideas to be clear, to avoid getting bogged down in philosophical muddles.
That's a good lesson for anyone who wants to think clearly, not just philosophers, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in all the fancy terms, but the goal should always be to actually understand better, not just to sound smart.
Totally agree. And this leads us to another fascinating part. how he uses logic to explore natural philosophy and metaphysics.
Okay, so now we've got this logician tackling questions about the nature of reality, the human soul, even the existence of God. How did that logical approach affect his views on those huge topics?
Well, remember how we talked about Marsilius being an empiricist? He thought that all our knowledge ultimately comes from our senses and those self-evident truths, those basic things that we just intuitively know.
He was starting with what we can observe, what we can learn from our experiences, right? That's pretty different from philosophers who mainly rely on reason or those big abstract principles.
It is, and it led him to some interesting conclusions. Take the idea of creation, for example. Based on what we see in the world, Marsilius said that nothing can come from nothing. We only ever see things coming from other things.
But doesn't that clash with the Christian doctrine of creation ex nihilo, creation out of nothing? How did he get around that?
Well, he made a key distinction. He separated what we can learn from reason and what we accept on faith. He argued that from a purely philosophical perspective, creation out of nothing is something we just can't grasp. It goes against our understanding of how cause and effect work.
So he's saying that there are limits to human reason, that there are some things that are just beyond our ability to understand.
You got it. He's saying that some things we can only know through divine revelation. Faith and reason might not always line up perfectly, and when that happens, faith is the ultimate authority.
That's pretty humble for a logician. You might expect him to try to force reason and faith to fit together.
It shows his intellectual honesty. He knew that human intellect has its limits and that humility is important when you're dealing with divine mysteries. This doesn't mean he gave up on reason. He still saw it as a powerful tool for exploring the world and God's creation. But he also knew that some truths, you can only get to them through faith.
So he wasn't a fideist, like completely rejecting reason in favor of faith, but he was okay with saying, hey, some things you just can't figure out with reason alone.
Exactly. And you see that balanced approach, again, in his ideas about the human soul, which he explored in his commentary on Aristotle's De Anima. Here he was following the Parisian tradition of thinkers like Buridan and Erasmi.
I'd love to hear more about that Parisian take on the soul. What made it stand out from other views at the time?
Well, the Parisian school, they argued that there's no natural proof that the soul is immortal. Like, based on what we see in the world, the most likely conclusion is that the soul dies with the body.
Wow, that's a bold statement for a medieval philosopher, especially one who's also a theologian. It almost seems like radical for that time.
It does, right. But again, Marsilius is drawing that line between what you can conclude based on reason alone and what you accept through faith. He's saying, yeah, philosophy might point towards the soul dying, but faith assures us that it lives on after death for eternal life.
It's another example of him saying, reason is valuable, but it's got its limits. Some things you just need faith for.
Yeah.
It's like this recurring theme in his thinking, this careful balancing act.
Absolutely. This commitment to both reason and revelation. That's at the core of Marsilius's work. He was always searching for that sweet spot, respecting what philosophy could tell us, but also acknowledging the authority of faith.
It's like he's bridging two worlds, the world of reason and the world of faith. He explores both, but recognizes that they have their own separate domains.
I love that. That's exactly what makes Marsilius so fascinating. He embodies all those complexities and challenges of trying to make sense of the world using both reason and faith.
So we've talked about his views on logic and natural philosophy and even the human soul. But what about metaphysics? That area of philosophy that tackles those really big questions like the nature of being, the existence of God.
Well, for Marsilius, metaphysics was that bridge between philosophy and theology. He believed that human reason, without help from revelation, could only get us so far in our understanding of God.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. What did he think we could learn about God using only reason?
He thought we could use reason to prove God's existence and to establish that God has, knowledge and will. But then there are certain aspects of God, like does God have free will or infinite power? Those questions, he thought, go beyond what reason can tell us.
So even for a thinker like Marsilius, who clearly was all about logic, he still saw limits to what philosophy could reveal about God.
Exactly. And he believed these limits, they applied even to the greatest philosophical minds, like even Aristotle.
Yeah.
He saw Aristotle as like the peak of natural reason, But even he couldn't give us definitive answers to some of those really fundamental questions about God.
It's like he's saying, even the smartest people need more than just reason to truly understand God. Pretty humbling perspective.
It is, and this leads us to another really cool part of Marsilius's work, how he interacted with other thinkers' ideas. He was obviously familiar with like all the big philosophical and theological debates of his time, and he wasn't afraid to really wrestle with all sorts of different viewpoints.
He wasn't just like working in a vacuum then. He was part of this bigger intellectual conversation, like building on and also challenging what others had said before him.
Totally. He drew from a whole range of thinkers. You have the nominalists like Occam and Buridan, but also more traditional figures like Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure.
Sounds like he was searching for like a synthesis,
Mhm.
trying to bring all these threads of thought together into one coherent philosophical system.
That's a good way to put it, and you can see this especially in his massive commentary on the Sentences by Peter Lombard. It was like the theological text in the Middle Ages. And Marsilius used this commentary to explore all sorts of intricate theological questions.
So, for someone who's really interested in the theological side of philosophy, what are some of the big ideas that Marsilius was tackling in that commentary?
One of the major themes is the nature of divine attributes. Marsilius, he was committed to the idea of the absolute unity of God. So he argued that attributes like wisdom, power, goodness, those aren't separate things within God. They're different ways of talking about the same divine essence.
So it's not like God has like different compartments for wisdom and power and so on. It's all one unified being, and those attributes are just different facets of that unity.
Right. And he applied that same logic to the concept of divine ideas. Some thinkers believe that God have, individual ideas for everything he created. But Marsilius said those ideas aren't really distinct in God's mind. They're just different aspects of God's knowledge of his creation.
He's taking away any sense of multiplicity within God, emphasizing his pure, undifferentiated being.
Yeah.
Really fascinating way to reconcile God's attributes with his absolute unity.
It is. This emphasis on God's unity, that's a real hallmark of Marsilius's theology. And he also tackled other tough theological issues, like the problem of evil.
Oh yeah, the classic question. If God is all good and all powerful, why is there so much suffering in the world? That's one that's plagued a lot of thinkers.
For sure. And Marsilius, he approached it pretty carefully. He admitted that, from a purely logical perspective, someone could argue that God is the cause of evil, because if God causes everything and evil exists.
Well, yeah, logically it seems to follow that God must be the cause. It's hard to get around that conclusion.
It is. But Marsilius argued that while that might seem logically sound, we can't accept that conclusion because it goes against faith.
So he's kind of setting limits on how far logic can go in theology, saying that there are certain truths that logic just can't fully grasp.
Yeah, and he was worried that using logic in like a really clever way could actually lead people away from faith, especially people who didn't have any philosophical training. He felt that theologians had this responsibility to uphold what the church taught and not to confuse people with tricky arguments.
It's like he's saying logic is a good tool, but it shouldn't be used to undermine faith. There's room for both, but you got to keep them balanced.
Perfectly put. That concern for clear communication, that's something we can definitely learn from Marsilius. I mean, he was involved in some really complex debates, but he always tried to present his ideas in a way that was, accessible and easy to understand.
That's so valuable in any thinker, right? We often think of philosophy as all about jargon and complicated arguments, but Marsilius reminds us that at the end of the day, it's all about communicating ideas. It's about helping people understand the world better.
I couldn't agree more. And that emphasis on clarity and precision, that's something we could all use a little more of these days. Totally. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Marsilius of Inghen, what are the big takeaways? What can we learn from this medieval thinker?
Well, I think Marsilius shows us that even philosophy from, hundreds of years ago can still have something to teach us. He was a product of this time, sure, but those struggles he had with balancing reason and faith, his insistence on clear communication, his willingness to tackle like the really tough questions, those are things that still resonate today.
He's a great example of how to approach philosophy with rigor, with humility, and with this genuine desire to understand the world and where we fit into it.
I love that. He reminds us that the big questions, about what reality is, what the soul is, our relationship with the divine, those questions are timeless. And they're worth thinking about. He encourages us to embrace all the complexities, to use both reason and faith as we search for truth. Well, thank you for taking us on this fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've got a whole new appreciation for for Marsilius of Inghen and for the lasting power of philosophical exploration.